construct this book. So, and you have an approach to the facts of what happened that night as an insider almost. So I was wondering if you could first start telling us the facts that construct this book.
I think that's very important, because a part of the way in which state violence is perpetrated is by trying to make it impossible to know what actually happened, and to condemn people into realms of speculation. And so part of the job, one small piece of a much broader social struggle of combating that state violence, is really investigating the events themselves, the facts. And so what we now know is that on the night of September 26 to 27, 2014, more than 120 police officers from 3 different cities, Iguala, Cocula, and Huizuco, as well as uniformed state police officers from the state of Guerrero, as well as uniformed federal police officers, collaborated to attack 5 buses of rural teachers' college students from Ayotzinapa, Guerrero, in southern Mexico, and also a bus of a youth soccer team, Los Avispones, from the Guerrero state capital, Chilpancingo, as well as other people who in different moments throughout the night arrive to try and help the students, teachers, as well as people just on the street, pedestrians and passengers in private vehicles, as well as taxi cabs. The attacks took place over a period of time of more than 9 hours, over a geographical area of more than 80 square kilometers, with all of these various levels of police. The attacks led to, during the course of the attacks, the police murdered 6 people, critically wounded one Ayotzinapa student, Aldo Gutierrez, with a shot to the head. He's in a coma 3.5 years later. More than 40 people, both students and non-students, were critically wounded by gunfire. One of the students who was murdered was mutilated, his body discarded in a trash pile after his killers had tortured him and cut off his face. And 43 college students from Ayotzinapa were forcibly disappeared by the police during the course of these attacks. The term of forced disappearance might need a little bit of context. This is where you have a state actor, in this case uniformed police officers from 3 different levels of government, who physically subdue a person, physically take that person, their body, and take them to an undisclosed location, and then basically lie about it, right? So the students are gone. They're missing, but they've been forcibly disappeared by the state, a figure which dates back to World War II and the Nazi regime, and then also circulates through the military dictatorships across Latin America, particularly in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, but that continues into the present and takes on a very particular form in the course of the so-called drug war in Mexico. So that is jumping into very horrific events, the basic description of the atrocity committed in and around Iguala, Guerrero, in Mexico, southern Mexico, on the night of September 26 to 27, 2014. It's incredibly complex, and we'll get into a lot of that, but that's, and I almost want to apologize, the horrifying, very brief description of the basic events, the facts.
And being here in the US, it's hard to imagine why would the state, maybe not that hard, but why would the state target these particular students? Why would they orchestrate something as big with all of these levels of complexity and all of these levels of state forces involved to just subdue whatever these students were doing? What is about these particular students in this school, this rural college school, that was so dangerous in that moment to orchestrate or to perform that action that is so violent and horrifying?
I think that's really important to consider for a moment who these students are, very purposefully speaking in the present tense, where they come from, where they're born, a bit of their context, a bit about their school. Most of the students of Ayotzinapa come from rural, indigenous, and campesino, or rural land working communities in the state of Guerrero, but as well as from surrounding states, Oaxaca, as well as Chiapas, Tlaxcala, Estado de Mexico. These are mostly states in southern Mexico and southern central Mexico. The schools themselves, they are 4-year college level public universities that only have education degrees, and only education degrees for elementary school teachers. So these are schools that train young men and women. In the case of Ayotzinapa, it's an all-male school, but there are other rural teachers' colleges that are all-female and some that are mixed. So these, on the national scale or context, these schools train young men and women to be elementary school teachers in rural communities. And the experience comes out of the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920, and the initiative, the design to create education for rural peoples. Instead of education that tries to dispossess rural peoples, force them into migration streams or into the outskirts of urban areas to be wage laborers, but an education crafted by and for rural life, and that respects rural life. These schools very quickly took on an explicitly socialist educational program, as well as a deeply and strong socialist student organizational structure. And so over the course of the 20th century, these students very quickly became kind of focal points for opposition and protest to the regime, to the state. And basic Mexican 20th century history, you have a single party that very quickly constructs an incredibly adept, intelligent, crafty state machinery of control, domination, and repression that becomes a single party state for 71 years, the Party of the Institutional Revolution, or the PRI. And these normal schools, as they're called in Spanish, escuelas normales, become hotbeds of protest and hotbeds of organizing, social organizing, counter to that state party institutional structure, which becomes intensely repressive. And in fact, the president of Mexico in 1968, who oversaw the massacre of hundreds of students in Mexico City on October 2nd, 1968, is the very president who closed about half of the rural teachers' colleges, Gustavo Díaz Ordaz. So there's a deep history of opposition between the rural teachers' colleges and the world that they represent, which is rural Mexico, which is indigenous Mexico, which tries to be something very different from the vision and the imposition of the centralized state based in Mexico City. In the case of Ayotzinapa, there were 2 graduates of that school who became very important armed insurgent leaders, left-wing guerrilla fighters of the late 1960s and early 1970s, Lucio Cabañas and Genaro Vázquez. And in that sense, Ayotzinapa, even in the broader context of these rural teacher schools as protest centers, like Ayotzinapa became a kind of focal point even inside that context of very intense student organizing against capitalism and against the centralized state machinery. So in the night of September 26th in 2014, first-year students, these are college students between the ages of 18 and their early 20s, who had just arrived at the school only a few months before, and in fact, had been going through mostly a lot of initiation and early kind of training exercises before classes began. For some students, the first day of classes was actually Friday, September 26th, 2014. That night, they had traveled to, and this will take a little bit of storytelling, but they traveled to commandeer a bunch of commercial passenger buses. We just arrived in Dallas today on Greyhound from Houston. So imagine college students organizing to block a highway, to stop a Greyhound bus, to ask politely for all the passengers to get off, and then ask the driver to drive them back to school. Something like that happens in Mexico in context of very intense social movements with some frequency. It isn't unique to Ayotzinapa. In a very intense way, in the teachers' rebellion in Oaxaca in 2006, this commandeering of public buses became a mainstay of the way in which movement organizers used to get around town. In the case of the Ayotzinapa students, that night they were traveling to commandeer a couple of buses to be able to lead a caravan from the school, from Ayotzinapa, to Mexico City, which is about a 3.5-hour drive on a federal highway. The plan was to accumulate a number of commandeered buses with their drivers. The drivers stay with the buses. They don't steal them. They just use them for a while and then let them go. To leave from the school early on the morning of October 2nd, 2014, to participate in the major student protests that happen every year in Mexico City to commemorate and protest the student massacres of 1968. So here the kind of cycles and horrendous ironies of history are very present in the sense that these students who are organizing to go to a protest against a massacre of students were themselves in that process attacked.
And I'm wondering, in the process of listening to the news for the first time about this, and then coming to here and presenting this book, what happened? How did you came to hear the news? How did you came to decide to go there? How did it came to be a part of your life so that it affected you so profoundly that you came and that you sit down and wrote this book?
Like many people, I saw the news on the newspaper the morning of September 27th, which is a Saturday. I don't use a cell phone with internet capabilities, which makes me kind of a number of things, but it also means I didn't know in the moment. A lot of my friends knew within a matter of minutes or hours what was happening in Guerrero. I didn't. I was actually having dinner with some dear friends from Ciudad Juarez. In fact, we ended up talking about student movements that night, talking about the students of Ayotzinapa without knowing that they at that moment were being attacked. I saw the news on the front page of a Mexico City-based newspaper online about 7 in the morning on Saturday, September 27th. And my immediate visceral reaction to the headline, at that moment the headline was 57 students of Ayotzinapa disappeared, 6 dead, police attacks in Iguala, something like that. But the number was 57 initially. So there's a lot of confusion that came from these attacks, which were themselves very, very complex. And there's also a state operation almost immediately in place to favor confusion and to favor rumors. My initial reaction to reading that was to think it's not possible. Like, they're not disappeared. They can't be disappeared. Obviously, who would want to believe that? My initial reaction is, it can't be. They've got to be hiding somewhere, or the cops took them and beat the crap out of them, and they don't know what to do yet, and they're trying to make up some kind of story to be able to then explain why the students had been beaten up. I was thinking in those terms. And although I had an initial reaction to just grab my backpack and go to the bus station, I also kind of questioned myself, because I had commitments, I had the things I had to turn in on that Monday, I had other commitments with other people. So I'm like, what are you doing? Are you just something horrible happens and you run after it? So kind of harsh self-interrogation. And I thought other people are there, other people are going to do this work. And I didn't go, which is actually something I regret that Saturday morning. Several days later, after a few days of seeing that there was no coherent explanation of the basic events out on the streets that night, of seeing that the media descriptions, which were divided basically between people that did some kind of reporting and quoted some people, between just rumors that were published through mostly newspaper columnists, that cite unidentified sources inside the government and then just publish whatever they wanted. It seemed to me that something very horrendous was happening. The students were in fact disappeared. At that point we knew that the number was 43. And and that it would be necessary.
What was that point though? What was that point? How much time passed between you hear the news and all this machinery happens, and you know this? We all know the number is 43.
It takes several days. I mean, some people knew that at the school they knew the number was 43 by the afternoon of Saturday, September 27th, because students whose names appeared in the first list in the newspapers that morning called the school and said, "Hey, we're safe. We just went home. Like, we escaped, we hid, and we went home." And so the number very quickly went to 43, but for that number to circulate through the media and replace the initial numbers that were first published took several days before everybody in the media were reporting the same number of disappeared students, which was and remains to this day 43. And it was when I saw that kind of disconnect and that there wasn't any kind of coherent explanation citing the people who lived through the experience themselves, I thought that it was just a kind of gut heart thing. This is the work I do. I report, I investigate, I write. I've got to go. So I grabbed the backpack and took the bus to Guerrero, first to Chilpancingo, then to the school. And initially, again, when I arrived at the school, which was October 3rd, I waited and went to the march in Mexico City for the October 2nd protests against the massacre of 1968. And then on October 3rd, I went, and arriving at the school, again, I kind of questioned myself, what am I doing here? What can I contribute? I need to have this very clear in myself before I talk to anybody. Right? And within a matter of minutes, and the school is in a very beautiful area in the hills, walk down this kind of hill, and there's a outdoor basketball court with a corrugated tin roof, but it's open air. And I saw all these people sitting around the edges of the court. And as I walked down into the court, I had this experience of just feeling waves of pain. And I realized these were all the families of the 43 students who had been disappeared by the police. And at that moment, I was like, I have my notebook in my hand and a pen, I'm a reporter. What am I doing here? And like, obviously, these are people that any decent reporter would want to talk to, would want to listen to. But I couldn't conceive in that moment, that morning, of any question that wouldn't be violent, of any question that wouldn't be horrendous, that wouldn't be a bludgeoning. I thought to myself, what's an open-hearted, beautiful, caring question? For example, how do you feel? How would that sound coming from me, a stranger, a foreigner, a white guy whose native language is English, arriving in this location to people who are looking for their children? It didn't seem possible. Like, in that moment, in that context, I couldn't conceive of a way to interview those people that wasn't violent. And so I didn't. I greeted the people I walked by and kept walking. And so in the course of literally walking across a basketball court, again, I had to think, what am I doing here? What can be done? What can be contributed? And I thought to myself, okay, there's this major state operation to lie about what happened that night. And through that lie, to get away with murder, because 6 people were murdered that night, to get away with mass injury, more than 400 people were critically wounded, one of whom is still in a coma, and to keep disappearing students. One particular characteristic of the horror of forced disappearance is that it extends through time, right? There is no end. You're looking for the person you love. You're looking for the truth about what happened to them. And so to lie about the events of that night, for me, was a part of disappearing the students, a part of disappearing people, inseparable from the actual act of physically submitting them and putting their bodies in the back of police vehicles. And so I thought, okay, this is important. We need to find them. We need to combat this forced disappearance and these lies. And so in a flash, it's like, okay, what is urgent, what needs to be done right now is to try and document what happened that night on the streets, to know what happened. And the people who know are the people who got shot at and the people who shot, right? And it's not possible at this moment because they're hiding and lying, the people who shot and the people who gave orders to shoot. We need to speak, and for many other reasons, we need to speak first with the people who were shot at, right? And I went I started interviewing a handful of students. Turns out I've spent time in that region of the country since the late 90s, originally as a researcher with human rights organizations, and then doing independent reporting. And so I have a lot of contacts with a lot of very deep friendships that go back almost 20 years. Excuse me. And a lot of friends who helped me almost immediately. Hey, we know this one student, we know a person in the student struggle committee, and they introduced me to them, asked permission, I presented myself, asked permission to talk to people, and did an initial round of about 4 interviews, and realized that the events had nothing to do with what had been published in most of the newspapers. At that point in time, they talked about the students went to boycott a mayor's wife's political event. And one of the first things that struck me is that simply didn't happen. So this major discourse, description coming both from the state and in the media of an event that the students themselves said, and they just like blew it off. They're like, oh no, that never happened. What we did was we went here, and then this happened, and then this other thing happened, right? And then we went there. I was like, that is urgent. And it's very complex because all of a sudden I realized that students were speaking from different locations and about different events, that it wasn't just one scene of attack. There were multiple scenes of attack. In the press, they talked about, seems like a minor detail, but it becomes incredibly important, 4 buses of students being attacked. But the students themselves described to me 5. None of them said we were on 5 buses, but they all said, okay, we were on this bus and this bus and this other bus went around here. And as I tried to draw little maps and understand what had happened, I realized there were 5 buses. And so I would go back and say, okay, let me see if I understand this. You guys were on this bus, and this bus, and then these other people, and put together a map, and it became very clear the students were on 5 buses and not 4. We can come back to later about why that becomes particularly important. But that was the basic kind of initial process. Again, I feel bad, or I critique myself of my clumsiness of not going immediately, like I should have trusted my gut, basically. But going and then very quickly deciding, okay, what can be contributed, what can be offered as a kind of labor participation is helping to document the events. Also, when I first did the first round of interviews, I felt really bad because I was like, surely a number of human rights lawyers, a number of other reporters have already asked these students to tell their stories, and so it's going to be like another reporter showing up and saying, will you tell me your story? And it turned out no. Most of the students who agreed to speak with me and who told me what they'd lived through that night hadn't spoken with anyone else. And not because they didn't want to, but because nobody else at that point, believe it or not, had shown up and asked. So they hadn't spoken with human rights attorneys, which kind of blew my mind. How is that possible that the human rights attorneys were doing that the next day? And you can kind of understand, again, because of the intensity and the multi-level nature of the atrocity, because so much focus was placed on looking for the 43 students who had been disappeared, somehow a lot of other things were neglected. Aldo Gutierrez was in a coma, and his family was trying to deal with that. Another student, Edgar, had been shot in the mouth and was knocked out for 4 days, and when he came to, began a process of reconstructive surgery to rebuild the bone, the upper maxillary bone inside his mouth, and then all the tissue that's still going on today, 3.5 years later, removing bones from his leg, skin from his calf, in order to reconstruct his mouth. So many things happened that were and are intense, but because of the focus and the kind of burning intensity and necessity of the forced disappearance, some of those things didn't receive the immediate attention that they should have. And one thing was to just very early on recognize the importance of speaking with the students, and then very quickly the urgency of speaking with all of them if possible. Every student who was there that night who would agree to speak with me. And in this case, I spoke with 26 student survivors, as well as a whole number of other survivors from the soccer team and from the teachers, from journalists who showed up and then later got shot at as well. And there were 4 students who didn't want to speak, and of course, their desire was absolutely respected.
So how do you transform this trust that you earn and these stories that you listen to into this book, and how do you make the decision, or how was the process of making the decision of constructing an oral history? Where was the point where did you ask yourself, should I put myself in the story? Should I be the one that's telling it, or should I let them tell it? How was that process?
Well, initially, as I was just describing, the initial kind of impulse was just to document, just to find out. And as soon as I saw, or I felt like I had an idea of the scale of the atrocity and the disparity between what the students told and what the government was saying and what was circulating in the media, and the urgency to communicate what the students were telling, and also the work of speaking to so many, because again, any one student knows exactly what they lived through, but since they were attacked in so many locations and at different points in time, no one individual student actually knew the whole story. And many months later, when I published the first magazine article, and then of course took them all copies, and then published the book, and the students would read it, many of the students told me, I didn't know the full story until I read the book. Because it turned out they didn't talk about it amongst themselves, because they were so intensely traumatized and impacted by the events that very quickly they entered into an unspoken agreement. They just didn't talk about it. And a lot of students told me, it wasn't until I read this book that I really knew everything that happened across the whole city. So I thought that this is valuable work. This is something to contribute directly to the struggle. I wasn't thinking about how can I write a good book. I was thinking about what can I do as a reporter that helps combat these lies and that helps find these 43 students. And so initially, the first thing I did was actually just a talk at a social struggle place location similar to this, but very much linked to the Zapatista movement in Mexico City, the Café de Comandante Ramona. That was the first time I shared some of the stories that the students had shared with me. And then a magazine piece, and then after publishing the magazine piece, excuse me, more students who'd survived that night kept coming back to the school. And so I kept going back to the school myself. I lived in Mexico City, but I was 3.5-hour bus rides. I would travel back and forth constantly and keep interviewing more survivors that returned. And after probably about 9 months, it was the end of June, coming on July, when the first anniversary of the attacks was approaching, and I thought, I want to be able to share now what I've been able to learn, what other people have shared with me, what I've been able to put together from the investigation and from the interviews. And so I very quickly thought, okay, what's the form that I can use to best share what I've learned? What narrative form can simultaneously convey the information, convey all the levels of emotion, and do so in a way that honors the students, what they lived through, that honors their own ways of telling the story, that is honest and respectful. And it was just kind of a flash. Basically, I'm in this weird generation where I'm still just basically all about paper. The whole computer thing and cell phones and all that, I just kind of miss that. And so I wrote my thesis by hand and all that kind of stuff in notebooks. And so I still work and think through paper. And so I transcribe, I print out, I reread and mark up transcripts, have everything printed physically on a space like a table or a series of surfaces, and try to think about the best way to tell the story, the most honorable way to tell a story. And in this case, I did that, and I had interviews with the student survivors, other survivors, but also interviews. I'd gone to all the government press conferences. I went to the March of the Wives of the police officers who had been arrested. I went to a lot of the initial discoveries of mass graves. I spoke to a lot of the police officers at those mass graves. I spoke to human rights lawyers, attorneys, activists, anthropologists, and then transcribed and printed everything out, as well as all the newspapers, all my notebooks from the marches, the different slogans that people were chanting in the marches, everything that I documented or written down, printed out. And when I looked at it, it just kind of seemed like a flash that it was just the students and the survivors. Like right now, it was immediate that I thought, it's not the time for me to write. It's not the time for me to write an essay or to offer an analysis. That time might come. And in fact, tonight, I hope to share a little bit of that. And in the English language version of the book, there's a little bit of that. But at that moment, I thought what is urgent is just sharing the description of those events of all the students and the other survivors. And so it appeared to me in kind of a flash. Obviously, there's the historical literary precedent of Elena Poniatowska's book La Noche Tlatelolco, which I think got translated into English as Massacre in Mexico, which is an oral history book of the attack and massacre of students on October 2nd, 1968. It's a brilliant work of oral history. But whereas she has this polyphonic structure that moves about in time and includes newspaper articles and chants from the marches, which as a reader I appreciate and love. It's an amazing book, but for this particular story, for whatever reason, I thought I just want to limit it almost exclusively, not exclusively, but almost exclusively to the survivors, and to really follow the students, like the group of students through time that night. So constructing an oral history book basically of one night with a multiplicity of perspectives and testimonies. And that's where this book came from. It's an attempt to share the information, share the stories, also simultaneously like honor the stories. And in this case, even though it's very subtle, because so much of what gets discussed is the brutality of the attacks and the trauma of the mass collective forced disappearance, but also there's an incredible, I think, portrait here of solidarity, of how the students interact with themselves as they're being attacked, the decisions they make. So there's a portrait of struggle here, there's a portrait of solidarity, and it becomes, at least for me, it's an attempt to be a kind of space of honoring and respecting the students.
This is my final question before you can read. So because this is an exercise in respect and in honoring these things that they share with you through talking and you listening, then how do you face translation, and how does these sounds, these voices, get translated into a different language? How do you keep that same respect and that same honoring in the act of translating these voices that are very particular to the space they inhabit?
So first is, when I first decided to try this, to share what I gathered and learned in this form of building an oral history book, of course all the interviews were conducted in Spanish. Spanish was the first language of most of the students, but not all of them. For many it was their second language. Their first languages are different indigenous languages of the region. And I was aware as I started to build the book itself from the transcripts, first off of what again, it's a region of the country I've spent a lot of time over the last 20 years, and I feel there's an incredible, just like anywhere in the world probably, but an incredible beauty and poetry to the spoken Spanish in that region. And so I very much wanted to respect that and honor that and kind of do a work, even though it's a kind of work of artifice or artist something, because you have a transcript. I just want to publish the transcript. So there's some kind of intervention there. But I had very clear rules for myself of what that intervention would be. Obviously the clear immediate rule was I would not insert anything. So not a single word, not an adjective, not a noun, not a verb, not a preposition, like literally nothing. That was a hard rule for myself. But then I said to myself, I will be able to extract things. So a very easy example would be if a student says pues, which means well, or something like well, but it's almost like it's a musical kind of rhythmic marker in Spanish in that region, pues, right? If they said it 3 times, I would delete 2 and keep 1. So you see there's an intervention, there's a kind of artistry, but there's also at least some idea of respecting orality, respecting spoken Spanish. You know, many editors, if you submitted a novel and it said pues 3 times, they'd draw a line through all 3. So at least there was some kind of effort to work with and honor and respect the orality of the spoken Spanish in that region. And also, I might as well say this now, the first people to read the first draft of the book were the students and the parents. Like I took printouts of the initial draft to the struggle committees of both the students and the parents, that they'd be the first people to be able to comment on it and tell me what they thought, if there's anything that was missing, if there's anything they didn't want to be included. The students themselves, almost all of them, chose to use pseudonyms and chose their own pseudonyms, so everybody gets to make sure that their pseudonym is what they want to be there, and that what appears on the page is what they said and what they want to share. So that was the initial kind of part of the initial work of crafting this text. And then translating it into English, the first thing I thought was just, me rindo, güey. No mames, no se puede. Like, there's no way to translate the beauty of this rural spoken, the power of this rural spoken Spanish into English. I've mostly been living outside of the United States for the last 20-something years, and at this point, I feel in some ways much more comfortable in Mexico in Spanish than in the United States in English. I feel like, I don't know, I've been in that language in a way over the last 20-something years. Or I feel it more present. And so I thought I didn't have the English capabilities to try and create a regional spoken English that would in some way parallel and honor the spoken Spanish. So I thought I would aim for a basic, kind of generic spoken United States, obviously. This is where I was born and grew up, 30-something or 40-something miles from here, until I was 14. English, you know, so I wouldn't translate llegaron los polis as the police arrived, right? But I'd say the cops arrived, which is kind of a generic slangish term or oral term for police. Or really choose some ways in which I could, like, some kind of version of spoken English, even though I was conscious of immediate defeat. I wouldn't be able to capture the power in the poetry. I didn't think I would be able to. I was going for some version of it. And key words that are essential for these students and for their daily lives, I decided not to try and translate in any way, and just to maintain in Spanish and to keep in italics, one, for rhythm, two, because I think people in the United States reading this in English should be reading some Spanish words and like learning them and getting used to them, and just the power. Like, so when they say paisa, like paisa, which is short for paisano, which means country person, but in Ayotzinapa it doesn't mean, oh, my country person, you know. It's like, and there would be no, if I said dude, that just would seem wrong in many ways. So I kept paisa, I kept compa, compañero y compañera, which I think are words that, for me, it's great to start using them in English as well. What's a bit of that? Stop the end. Oh, should I read a little bit?
Yeah.
How are we on time? So I said the book's an oral history, and of course each student granted explicit permission for the interviews, explicit permission to appear in the book. They chose their names, and the way it's structured is that, I don't know if you can see, my eyesight's horrible, I wouldn't be able to see it, but in bold-faced type in all caps appears a name, usually an age, and a grade, what class the different students are in, and the entire story progresses chronologically like that, all in first person from the various different, mostly students, and then later other people come in, journalists, teachers, and so on. And the students begin talking a bit about where they're from, a bit about their childhoods, their lives, their communities, why they wanted to go to Ayotzinapa to study there, what the school meant for them, what their ambitions were. For example, a student that moved me very much told me, Juan Perez is his name in the book, that he's from an indigenous Mepa community in the state of Guerrero, and he said that there had never been a teacher, an elementary school teacher in his hometown, his community, that spoke his native language. And he wanted to be an elementary school teacher in his hometown speaking his own native language. So imagine it'd be a kind of cultural shock for some people, but this is the impacts of colonialism in which we live in all the territories of this entire hemisphere. But these are people who in the year 2014 had never had an elementary school teacher who could say good morning in their own language to them. And this young man wanted to be a teacher, an elementary school teacher in his community. So students talk about where they're from, their decisions they made to go to the school, their first days at the school, a bit of a mini portrait of the initiation rituals they engage in with the students called the trial week or la semana de prueba. And then after 20 or 30 pages, the book follows the students as they leave on 2 buses the school that night on their way to Iguala, and follows them through the full arc of the night and dawn, the full arc of the attacks, until it's the morning of September 27th, when they realize that their colleagues, compañeros, have been forcibly disappeared, that they hadn't been taken to jail. Because for many, many hours, when they saw the police grabbing their compas and throwing them in the backs of police trucks, they thought the police take people detained to jail, right? And it wasn't until several hours later in the early morning when they're all gathering at a state courthouse that they can't find the students, and they start to realize that they're missing, that they've been disappeared by the police. And at that point, the story continues with a number of fathers and mothers who were the first to start looking for their children, especially, and one mother in particular who just talks about her son. Another father who confronts the governor of Guerrero and tells him a thing or two. But so I'll just read 3.5 pages of some of what the students shared. So, Miguel Alcocer, 20 freshmen. The police started shooting. The compañero said that the police were shooting in the air, and I think they were. So many squad trucks started arriving. There were 3 buses and a caravan, and I was in the lead bus. I don't know much about Iguala, but we were on a straight street, and on that street the municipal police would pull out from the intersections. At that time, the shots were coming directly at us. The driver kept going straight ahead, and the police would drive up and shoot at us. Some compañeros, under the stress of being shot at, got off the bus and picked up rocks. I think there is a zócalo, or town square, around there. I don't know what was going on, but there was some kind of a park, and there were a lot of people around. A municipal police officer cut us off around there. The squad truck blocked us, and the cops shot directly at us. There were also police shooting at us from behind. You couldn't run anywhere. Some compañeros managed to find some rocks and threw them at the squad truck and broke the windshield. So the cop moved the truck out of the way, and we were able to keep going. Edgar Yair, 18, freshman. At first, the police were shooting in the air. We weren't scared because we knew that they couldn't shoot at us because we're students, and they can't do that to people like us. We kept going, and at every street corner we passed, police squad trucks pulled out, and the bullets were coming more and more directly at us each time. And we had rocks, whatever we could find. We threw rocks at the police because they were shooting at us. There were 3 buses and a caravan. I was in the second bus. We drove down that whole avenue, and the cops didn't even care that there were so many other people around, kids, women, all kinds of people. And the cops didn't respect those people. As we drove along the avenue, we didn't care about anything. What we cared about was getting out of there as soon as possible. Ivan Cisneros, 19, sophomore. We came to what I think was a zócalo, or something like that. I couldn't see well. When the first municipal police truck started pulling up, they didn't tell us to stop. They just pulled out in front of us and started cocking their guns and aiming at us. And that's when we got angry, because before, when we were asking for donations on the highway, the federal police would show up with the same attitude, cocking their weapons, but we would instantly tell them that we were students and unarmed. And then the police would think about it, and their commander or the person in charge would tell them to lower their guns. And so that's what we did. It's kind of like a truce. When we say we're students, we don't have any weapons, and we show our empty hands in the air that we're unarmed, that was when, before, the police would lower their weapons and we'd have to start some kind of a dialogue. That's the way it had been before. For example, the state police in Chilpancingo say to us, "Young men, you can't grab vehicles like that. You have to come to an agreement with the bus companies," and blah, blah, blah. Stuff like that. But at that moment, the police didn't act like that. We said, we're students, we're unarmed, but the police didn't give a shit. They kept aiming at us, and that's when we heard the first gunshots from the back of the caravan. I told the others to get off the bus and grab rocks. We started pelting the squad truck that was blocking us. That truck took off, but we still heard gunshots coming from behind. They kept shooting, but I think they were shooting in the air. At that moment, we ran ahead to stop traffic from the side streets so that the bus could get through. All along the way, we kept hearing gunshots. They popped in the air. Ernesto Guerrero, 23, freshman. Leaving the bus station, we made it about a block and a half when the first two police squad trucks came out of nowhere. At no point did they signal for us to stop. At no point did they try to speak with us. They simply started firing their weapons in the air. We were in a caravan of 3 buses, the 2 Costa Line buses that we had just taken, and the Estrella de Oro that was in the rear. I was in that bus, the 3rd one. When we heard the gunshots, one of the sophomore compas was with us said, "Don't be scared, paisas. They're just shooting in the air." But when we got off the bus, we saw that they were not shooting in the air, but also shooting at the bus, and then they started aiming at us. That's when we made the decision to defend ourselves. How? In the road, I found 4 rocks, and 4 rocks are what I threw. We didn't have any choice. We had to defend ourselves with whatever was around, or let them kill us without putting up any defense. At least I'm of the opinion that if they're going to kill me, at least let it be while I'm defending myself. And, well, I found 4 rocks and I threw 4 rocks. It was obvious that the municipal police wanted to take our lives. The gunshots were aimed at the bus and at those of us who had gotten off the bus. That was when we decided to get back on the buses. We ran a bit farther down the road. The Iguala police were still shooting at the buses and I didn't find any more rocks. How was I to defend myself? I ran. The 3rd bus in the caravan closed its door. The 2nd bus had its door already closed too. I ran up to the 1st bus, and that was when I was able to jump on. I stayed there in the entrance by the door of that bus. Andres Hernandez, 21, freshman. The police had already blown out the tires of that 1st bus where I was riding. I realized this when a squad truck pulled out in front of us and parked there to block our way. All the police got out of the squad truck, hid around the street corners, and shot at us. So what we did was run up to the squad truck to push it out of the way. We were pushing the truck when a 2nd squad truck came up within 6 or 7 meters of us. It pulled up and the police shot at us, brutally, without thinking twice about it. They shot at us, and that was when the first compañero, a student in my group named Aldo Gutierrez Solano, fell. When we saw that he had fallen, it enraged us. We wanted to escape, but the police were shooting at us, so we ran back to hide behind the 1st bus. In my case, I was there behind that 1st bus, taking shelter.
So we have some time for questions, if you guys have any questions for this guy.
For this guy?
For this guy right here.
I just want to start saying thank you very much for coming in. It's a very fascinating story. It's amazing. If you lived in Mexico, well, this isn't the question. You've been in Mexico for 20 years?
No, I lived in Mexico starting in 1999, but I moved around a lot, but I've been there pretty much steady since 2006,
Okay.
about 12 years.
Well, my question is sort of about the institutionalized Mexican state. I understand that the PRI is in power now, but 2 points of it. Did things change when their reign ended in 2000? And Vicente Fox came in, and those 12 years upon. And the second part is, do you see a change going from Obrador? And I understand there's 2 ends of the political spectrum, one on the left and one on the right. I guess PRI be in the middle. But do you think that the election of PAN changed the institution of Mexico, or the election of Obrador will, or do you think that there is a Mexican state apparatus that, regardless of who's in power, it's going to be largely the same?
Thanks for that question. Before I offer some kind of reflection and answer that question, I want to emphasize something I think is very important, especially being someone from around here and who is speaking now in Dallas, Texas. And I don't think you did this, I just think this is an opportunity to share this reflection for me of making sure we don't exoticize political violence in Mexico and thinking that things that happen in Mexico are these terrible, awful things that don't happen anywhere else. I think what an exhaustive study, for example, just of these attacks and these events show to us, reveal to us, are very deep things about the Mexican state, but also very deep things about the structure of the contemporary state. And I think that these similar things play out in the context of the United States, often to a scale that is even more devastating. Just one brief example would be the war against Iraq, right? And the war on terror, which is a thing created by the United States government, which has enabled them basically to invade countries across the world, particularly the Middle East, and unleash a machinery of murder and pain and suffering and death beyond comprehension that is still going on to this day, and that was based on lies, right? We all know they were lies. It's not a conspiracy theory thing to say it anymore. We know that there were no weapons of mass destruction. We know that the attempt to connect the Saddam Hussein regime to the attacks in New York City on September 11th, 2001 were entirely bogus and forced. And so just as a little brief window into the way in which the United States government and the particular structure of the state in this country itself unleashes and administers overwhelming systems and machineries of horror and suffering and death. Sorry if that's a little overblown in cursi or something like that, but I think it's important, especially as someone from here, to just remind ourselves that what we're talking about in Mexico isn't unique to Mexico, even though there are unique characteristics to the machinery of repression of the Mexican state. But to be careful not to exoticise that, and even in the case of looking at police murder in the United States and the way in which that's intensely racialized and based by class and gender discrimination as well, and the way in which the state itself protects the police killers. It produces the same impunity, though it does it through a different mechanism, right? But in the end, the police killers go free, just like they do in Iguala. So with that caveat, I would say that in 2000 in Mexico, there was a myth of a transition, right? A myth of a democratic transition. And I remember at the time, I was actually there as an electoral observer in Guerrero in 2000, interviewing people in the Costa Chica region where a number of these students are from, and asked them what they thought about the election results and the fact that the PRI was going to finally be out of power. And they said to me, look, it doesn't matter what color t-shirt the people administering the state put on, whether or not it has the national colors, which are green, red, and white, right, of the PRI and the national flag, or if they're blue and white, which are the colors of the PAN party, which is Vicente Fox's party. It's like the PRI controls the state. The PRI administers it, right? And whether or not the PRI puts on a different t-shirt or not, they're going to keep administering that power. What we saw, I think, with Fox's administration, notice how it begins with the myth of transition and the hope of all these things, and almost immediately a major human rights attorney, Digna Ochoa, is murdered in her office in Mexico City while Andrés Manuel López Obrador is mayor of Mexico City, and the same machinery of impunity immediately jumps into action. Yeah. She is accused of her own murder. They said that she shot herself with, by the way, according to the forensic evidence, means that she took a .22 caliber pistol, shot herself in the leg, and then reached around her, shot herself in the head like this, but with a distance of something like 8 inches, and then also, after she'd been dead for an hour and a half, rolled her own body over. Right? That's according to the López Obrador administration investigators. So very quickly, we were able to take some kind of temperature of the transition, I think, with the political murder of human rights attorney Digna Ochoa on October 19th, 2001. But really, if you want to take the temperature, look at how the Fox administration concludes. It concludes with mass police rape of more than 40 women on May 4th, 2006 in San Salvador Atenco, and the absolute impunity of that mass police rape. Many of the women who denounced that they'd been raped by riot police also in their testimony included the fact that the riot police had condoms as a part of their uniform, right? That level of sexualized state violence and absolute impunity. To this day, the women are still fighting in the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights court system. Look at, of course, the allegations of electoral fraud, that the elections had actually been stolen from López Obrador in favor of Felipe Calderón. If you go into all the technicalities of that and how, and eventually they come to the official conclusion that López Obrador lost to Felipe Calderón by less than half a percentage point, the mass mobilizations, and then also, very importantly, there are a number of things that were very intense that year in terms of social mobilization and repression, but also to name one that's particularly important, the teachers union strike that was brutally repressed on June 14, 2006 in Oaxaca, the capital of Oaxaca City, the capital of Oaxaca State, that itself became an unarmed insurrection uprising, literally took over an entire state, including all the modes of transportation and media companies, television stations, radio stations for 6 months until the federal police were sent in to crush it. During that course of an unarmed insurrection in Oaxaca, state and federal forces collaborated to organize paramilitary death squads that literally drove through the streets and shot people dead. In that context, the international media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the AP, Reuters, the international human rights community, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, everybody did this, right? And that, for me, was taking the temperature of the democratic transition. At the end of the first administration was mass rape as a form of state terror, was paramilitary death squads, was lies, was cover-ups, was electoral fraud, right? And then the administration that comes in, which is also the PAN, the first thing they do, in a sense copying George W. Bush after the questioned elections of 2000 and the attacks in New York, they declare war, right? But in this case, they declare instead of a war on terror, it's a war on drugs inside their own country. And in the case of just 6 years, really, I think, and Majo can speak to this more deeply and from lived experience as well, like the country's changed in a very fundamental way. But I think my way of trying to make some sense of that change is the following. The war on drugs is basically a market. I like to think of it in economic terms. It's like a market. It's always been a market. It's been a market in the United States. It's a market that was designed in the United States in the 1960s by the Nixon administration with explicitly racist intent to disguise oppression of black communities in the United States as something else, as something that isn't political. And then it's been expanded and exported and used to perpetuate Cold War interventions across Latin America as public health issues, right? Drugs. By the way, brief parenthetical. Think about the fact that the United States has a global police force, the DEA, with presence in more than 120 countries across the globe. For a public health issue, substance abuse, like imagine if Venezuela had a global education police force showing up in the United States and saying, you know, your public schools really aren't up to par. We're going to start arresting some people. Or if like Bolivia sent, or Cuba sent a public health police force all over the United States to say, what is this? People don't have health insurance? People can't afford the medicine that saves their lives? No, we got to put some people in jail. The United States does that, and it's completely normalized. And everybody just thinks it's normal. The United States has a global police force supposedly for a public health issue, right? It's not a public health issue. Of course, it's a major transnational marketplace. So the drug war in the United States, but also in Mexico, is itself a marketplace. And when you inject money into the drug war, the drug market expands. What's good for the drug war market is good for the drug market. Every time over the last 40-something years, first the United States and later Latin American countries as well, inject funds, cash, into the war on drugs, their drug markets boom. Right, cocaine production skyrockets, marijuana production skyrockets, now heroin production skyrockets, right? The markets are linked, they're inseparable in fact. There is no contemporary drug market in the way we now live it without the drug war market. And so with Felipe Calderón declaring this war on drugs as this preemptive move to militarize the country, to quash all of this incredible social mobilization taking place all over the place, served to, and also was related to all the things happening in the United States with marijuana legalization, with OxyContin and then the repression of Oxycontin and this creation of a new or expanded heroin market in the United States, all of things collaborate such that these markets just explode. Business is booming. It's neoliberal times for drugs and for drug warring. And in that context, my way of trying to think about what's been happening recently is that the previously interrelated, complex interrelationships between the state and organized crime, in corporate terms, they start to merge, those two sectors. Think of it like in Amazon buying Whole Foods, you know? Like what were previously separate but interrelated, they merge under a same corporate structure, even though there's all sorts of infighting, there's all sorts of internal competition, and some of that internal competition explains a lot of the violence, but not all of it. So that's kind of what I think happened in those 12 years. When Peña Nieto comes back, one of the main reasons, and it's kind of a mind-blowing irreality to think that in 2012, the party that ruled Mexico officially for 71 years and never really left, campaigned on the fact that they were going to be change, right? And also the subtext was, yeah, the PRI's corrupt, but they controlled it. Like, yeah, they stole and they robbed and they collaborated with drug trafficking, but they didn't hang people from bridges and leave heads in the trunks of cars, right? And so this was kind of the subtext that contributed to the PRI's return. But then what happens in 2012 when Peña Nieto takes office is that all of the front page news stories of drug violence disappeared. A whole generation of critical, young, brilliant, hardcore, out in the streets Mexican journalists, men and women who were doing that reporting for 6 years, almost all of them were in one way or another fired. And they're all freelancers now. I know this because they're my friends, right? I spent that whole sexenio with them hanging out. And they used to work for Reforma, for El Universal, for Proceso, for La Jornada, for Excelsior, por Dios. And now they're almost all freelance, right? The media control that the PRI bought back was old school, good old fashioned. We put on the front page what we want. All that news, which was bad press for Calderon and the PAN, disappeared. And also, this isn't a reflection, this isn't like a scientific proof, but something I think happened is that the theatrical murders reduced. There were less of the bodies hanged from bridges, of the theatrical dressings, I won't describe them, of murdered people, and more people started disappearing. Forced disappearance as a tactic of state terror was kind of reinvented in the context of this narco-state fusion, and exploded. In a course of 10 years, more than 30,000 people officially have been forcibly disappeared in Mexico. That parallels the Argentine military dictatorship of the 1970s and early 1980s. So that gets us to the present and the last part of your question, which was López Obrador. Personally, I don't trust any part of him or think any part of him is genuine, or this image of the left wing committed to the people below that he's presented himself to be, and that's based on these years of living. And for example, just take Ayotzinapa. When do you see him use his power, appear before a camera and say, this is unacceptable, we must find them? Something that simple. Not once. Part of my particular profound rabia, profound anger with him is that it seems like he hasn't even been in pain. He hasn't even hurt with everything that's happening. He's been campaigning since about 2004. That's my opinion. And when you look at, even in 2006, during the presidential campaign debates, he didn't show up to the first one. When he showed up later, the question of Atenco and the violence in Atenco on May 4th came up, and Felipe Calderón said, palabras más, palabras menos, mano dura contra los macheteros. Which basically mean, an iron fist against the rabble, rousers, right? The macheteros, people who use machetes, so derogatory word for rural people and rural people protesting concretely the organization in Atenco. López Obrador, after Calderón said that, Instead of saying, what is this? What is this iron fist business? Like, let's unpack this. Let's talk about what this means in the context of all these people just being beaten and a few people being murdered and women being mass raped by the police. Instead of doing that, he said, I'll let you all remember that the PRD police also participate in those raids. Like, he was trying to say, we also repressed. Like, we were part of that iron fist, right? That's El Peje. That's López Obrador. He also, by the way, in the WikiLeaks cables that were released in 2011, 2012, that first main wave of the embassy cables that got released, there was an embassy cable where the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City did a report back of a meeting before the elections on July 3rd, 2006, where they met with López Obrador, and López Obrador had said, I'm fully committed to the war on drugs. In fact, I plan to use the military to combat the war on drugs, like militarize the country, which is what Felipe Calderón did.
Is there any hope for justice for the families who are left behind?
I mean, I think they are the hope for justice, and we are the hope for justice. The hope for justice is people that keep painting portraits of the 43 students and showing up tonight to share them with us. The hope for justice, the families that continue to look for their children and to continue to organize and continue to pressure. Any hope for anything that could resemble, without giving us shame, something like justice, for me, comes from us, comes from down below, comes from social organization. I don't have any hope for justice from political parties, from Donald Trump, from Peña Nieto, from the police, personally. Where I seek and find incredible sources of hope, like Majo shared with us, that it's really beautiful, is from the people in these epicenters of pain who don't stop, who don't give up, who keep struggling, who keep speaking out, which could and might be all of us too.
Let me ask you something about your reporting exercise. You mentioned most of your colleagues has been, I don't know if exiled, but at least just going to the freelance world. It's like two questions. So do you think like exercises like Animal Político, Mexicanos contra la Corrupción are helping to fill that gap, and how powerful, or which future do you see to these small media that are trying to be investigative in these conditions? And about yourself covering this story, how do you take care of yourself?
Well, in terms of, I think there's been an incredible and wonderful burgeoning or flowering of alternative media, independent media across the world. Very concretely in Mexico in the last 10 plus years. Animal Político, for example, in Ayotzinapa, is Paris Martinez, who's one of their correspondents, who was the first person. What he did when he arrived at the school, and similar to me, was trying to figure out what can I do, right? And the first thing he did was he went and found friends of all of the 43 students who had been disappeared and interviewed them about the disappeared students. And like, what music did they listen to? Like, what clubs were they in? What towns are they from? And so you can still find this online. He published the first long piece. There was just these short excerpts, short paragraphs about each of the 43 students, so they wouldn't just be a name and a number, but just to like read a tiny bit about them, which I think is an incredibly important and amazing and honoring act of journalism. That's Animal Político. Animal Político, of course, have done these incredible investigative pieces recently about major, mega, like $100 million scandals with both the Veracruz state government and later the federal government, exposing through solid, good investigative reporting how state governments and the federal government use false contracts with universities to create all of these kind of like ambiguous, not seen realms of financial activity where they then just like disappear millions and millions and millions of dollars. So that's Animal Político. There are a bunch and very divergent and different expressions, a lot of them online. Like I said, this is just me being kind of a fool, but I'm really partial to old school media, like community radio stations and print stuff. This is stuff I like. I'm not saying it's better, it's worse. Stuff I like. I know that you can't do anything these days if it's not online as well. But I think there's an excellent and to be supported and celebrated increase in independent investigative journalism, concretely in Mexico. In terms of me, what do I do to like take care of myself? I read poetry and go to the gym. Like no, like I hang out with my friends. No, I tell people where I'm going. I don't know. You have to. No, I totally do. You have to do a number of things, because it turns out that the entire structure, institutional structure that is legally charged with protecting you, is one of the things that's most dangerous for you. Right? And so you have to be profoundly aware of that and navigate around that. And again, kind of similar to what I've been saying here, you can already tell that I'm like this little anarchist kid, but like with informal networks of friends and other journalists, that's where you really create protection. Stuff that doesn't necessarily get named or become a nonprofit organization, but they're formed over years, like deep friendships, and sharing of contacts and sharing of information, monitoring each other when we go to various regions. A very dear friend of mine, Marcela Turati, is a brilliant Mexican reporter. When she goes to Tamaulipas, especially regions like San Fernando that are incredibly, incredibly difficult, even if it's just old school text, but I'm like on text and email in Mexico City, sending messages every hour, you know, like, ¿Qué onda, cómo vas? You know, how's it going? All good. You know, if she's in the middle of an interview, it'll just be like, all good, or something like that. And we have code words already to make sure, and to monitor each other, make sure we're all safe. And then a kind of street smarts that you start to cultivate over the years of knowing how to read certain territories. And also very, very key is to trust people who live in the regions. You go to report when you don't live there. I live in Mexico City, and the people in Mexico City pretty much are the reporters who run the least amount of risk. The reporters who run the most amount of risk are those living and reporting and publishing all in the same regions, especially regions like across the state of Veracruz, but also Sinaloa, also Tamaulipas, Coahuila, Sonora, Chihuahua, a number of regions and states. And I'm especially being aware of being an international reporter, I have a U.S. passport, making sure that communicating with people, organizing with them, and not stealing from them, right? Like not robbing them. If I show up in Culiacan, Sinaloa, and I don't know anything, and if there's any way I'm going to be able to contribute something useful, I'm going to have to speak to the people who live there and work stuff. So, for example, when I went to Culiacan in 2010, in the heat of a lot of really intense stuff, what I thought I could do that was maybe unique and useful was to actually write profiles of Mexican journalists. Because the Mexican journalists were doing the hardcore work, and I didn't want to steal from them, right? I didn't want to go interview them and then publish it as if my own. So I would propose to them, hey, can I write a profile of you? And most people said yes, and then we negotiate whether or not we use their real names or not. And then through those contacts and friendships over many years, there's a very solid, even though very informal, network of journalists across the country. In fact, for example, Marcela, who's on WhatsApp, they have a national, like, kind of critical journalist, totally informal, nobody's paying them, they don't get any funds from anybody, WhatsApp group. And as soon as anything happens, like for example, recently, there were some independent alternative press journalists who were covering the independent candidacy of Marichuy. Maria de Jesus was a candidate for kind of pre-candidate gathering signatures to get on the ballot of the presidential elections in Mexico as part of the National Indigenous Congress. And they were stopped and forced out of their vehicles by ununiformed men with machine guns. And then they took some of the material and let them go. But almost immediately, one person hid their cell phone, was able to send out a message like, hey, we just got stopped by these ununiformed armed people. And then within minutes, that was all over the country, journalists all over the country putting stuff out on Twitter, on Facebook, and within a matter of less than half an hour, then you have, because again, you're trying to make things hugely public to force the state, which is the biggest drug organization in the country, to do something, to have to pretend like it is what it says it is, right? And so they say, oh, no, okay, yeah, we're gonna send these police trucks to go escort this group and take them, but it's un juego, it's a play, it's a negotiation with the state, but where you're using publicity and public visibility to try and protect people. And that kind of stuff is incredibly important. Long story short, is basically organizing. I'm sorry if that was really windy.
So, since you've written this book and reported on the attack, if you were asked by someone in either law enforcement or by some of the families to be an aid on an investigation of finding these students, what do you think is the most important question to ask first, or what would you want to find the answer to first?
It's a very good question. My niece just asked me that question. I haven't seen her in 9 years. I think in terms of solid investigation, the first thing to be done, I believe, is still to have a rigorous and exhaustive documentation of the attacks. From the analysis of that information, then we can start to ask incredibly important questions. So now it turns out we have that. We have a very exhaustive documentation of attacks that comes from multiple sources. I've done this reporting with the students, a number of other reporters have also interviewed the students, and very importantly, a group of independent experts that were explicitly supported by the families, which ended up getting called by their Spanish acronym GIEI, or GIE in Spanish. They produced 2 reports that total over 1,000 pages that have an exhaustive documentation of those attacks. So with that information, we already now have gathered, and we know, I think one of the most important questions is, what was the chain of command that night? Who gave the orders? So this is still a factual question. It's a question that could be researched and identified, right? And in fact, the state, if they wanted to, could really find that by just doing exhaustive cell phone, telephone analysis. If you took all the cell tower communications, you have all the numbers of the soldiers in town that night, of the police in town that night, you gather them all, you do all the analysis of the cross callings, and then you start to be able to place different police officers in different locations, different cell towers, different times, what are their movements. Similar kind of thing can be done with security camera footage. Gather all the security camera footage from private businesses, from public buildings, from the federal highway surveillance system, which is intense in Mexico and goes through the city. You could gather all of that video footage, view it all, analyze it all, and then start to see, okay, what are the times when different police forces arrive? Where do they arrive? Where do they arrive from? You could conduct an analysis with telephone and video information, not even getting to testimony yet, into interviews, just from that would enable you, I think, to draw some kind of a chain of command structure, right? And then start asking questions, okay, who was on duty that night, in this office, who are they? And then you go interview those people. It would not be tech orders that night. The problem is the people who gave the orders that night are the people in charge of investigating who gave the orders that night. That's the problem. A counterexample, I just spent several months in Chihuahua working on a number of things, one with a number of colleagues. We were looking at the murder of a brilliant Mexican journalist, a woman named Miroslava Beach, who was murdered last year. It turns out the state government in charge of investigating her murder gathered 300 hours of video camera footage from across the city, viewed it countless times, edited it down to 14 minutes, and was able to reconstruct the trajectory of arrival and departure of the killers, the 2 cars that they traveled in. They also had video footage itself of the murder. They also captured several moments where you can see different participants in the murder. There are 4 men participating in the murder. One driving, one when he gets out of the car, others when they get out of the car in a different location. They were able to construct this. Now here it turns out the state government reconstructs this murder and stops there. They don't ask the question, who ordered it? What was the chain of command? Who could have possibly paid for this, right? Any of those questions. They just focus on the mechanics of that moment, but they didn't. Compare that to what happened in Iguala. In Iguala, for example, one of the buses of students that was attacked and from which more than 20 students were forcibly disappeared and are still disappeared to this day, that bus was in front of a state courthouse, the Guerrero State Courthouse of Iguala. That courthouse had more than 6 different security cameras. Another organization called Forensics Architecture did an analysis where they took photographs of all those video cameras, were able to identify the company, the model number of all the different cameras, got in touch with those companies, And we're able to identify the type of lens used in those specific cameras. And by knowing that and knowing the position, to identify the angle of vision. Right? They reproduce, you can watch this online if you type in forensic architecture Ayotzinapa. There's an amazing series of videos that are all online that use architectural tools and digital technology and design to visually reconstruct the forensic analysis of some of these attacks. It's all online for free. And you can see the angle of vision of those security cameras, which completely capture the entire scene of attacks. When the independent experts went to the state courthouse and asked to review those video images, the director of the state courthouse told them, direct quote, "I destroyed that image. I destroyed those images because I didn't see anything of legal value in them." So again, this is the state administering the impossibility of investigating instead of the state investigating. I think your question is excellent, and we are able to identify, just from what we know, first from just speaking to the people who were there. Just from speaking to the people there, we're able to identify enough information to know this was a major operation that involved military coordination, involved electronic communications, because they were attacking at disparate locations simultaneously, and over time, they were communicating with each other with radios and cell phones. And somebody is giving orders. Also, because if you look at the logic of the attacks, first, what do? They shoot at the students and then stop them. Once they stop them, there's a period of time, 30 to 40 minutes, when nothing happens. They just hold them there at gunfire, right, or at gunpoint. Afterwards is when they pile the students into the back of multiple trucks from 2 different locations and drive away with them. Right? They then threaten the students who remain, saying, if you guys don't leave, we'll come back for you, and you'll regret coming here from the rest of your lives, direct quote. Those students don't leave because they think, and notice this, the students who get so demonized in the press and by the government as violent, as rioters, as lawbreakers, they were the ones that night who actually risked their lives and acted as if a state and a rule of law existed. They were the ones who acted as if there were such a thing as the law. Because when they were threatened with death to leave, they looked around and they saw a crime scene, a crime that had happened, the police that had illegally attacked them. They saw blood stains on the street and bullet casings as evidence. Conceptually, they're thinking in terms of a state and a rule of law, and they stayed there. And they got attacked again. More students were murdered because they made that decision to stay, because they believed that that thing called the rule of law existed, and because they didn't want to abandon their colleagues. Right? Out of solidarity, they stayed. Right? But because of the information of their being there, witnessing, we know enough to elaborate an analysis. There was a chain of command, and through that we know enough to say, okay, if we looked at telephone records, if we looked at video footage, is in addition to mass survivor testimony interviews, gather all this information, and then start asking questions. Okay, my answer to your question, which again, this is horribly long-winded and windy way, is we would ask, like, what was the chain of command? Who gave the orders? Most prestigious newspapers in Mexico, Reforma, based in Mexico City. And the article purported to use court records from Chicago, the United States, some drug trials, to show that there are all these phone calls from Chicago to Iguala and Guerrero on the night of September 26th to 27th in 2014, and that those calls were evidence that drug gang members in Chicago were actually controlling, administering, and ordering the different events and the attacks. However, if you just look at the article first off, none of the quoted material in any way supports those conclusions. The quotes are very abstract, and they seem like, oh, a bunch of stuff is happening. Oh, there's some packages on the way. And they're saying, oh, these are code words. But the conclusion drawn in Reforma is that in Chicago, drug traffickers ordered all these things. And yet there's,
And they were guiding it. Right?
They were guiding it throughout, but there's not a single quote that represents orders or guidance, right? But this fits into a pattern that has been consistent from the very beginning of the mythology that the police first stopped the students and then turned them over to a drug gang. 3.5 years later, there is not a single, not one piece of forensic evidence, there is not one direct survivor eyewitness testimony to the effect that the police turned the students over. What we know is that the police took them, and after that we don't know where they are, right? And so the state's initiative and the state's energy is always about creating this mythological idea of a drug gang that did all the bad stuff. Right? The police were corrupt, too bad. Sorry, the local cops, they get paid crap, and so they're easily corruptible. That's kind of and it also helps buffer the idea that you need a stronger federal police, stronger federal state. But it's insane that more people don't point this out, but you're like, oh wait, but the federal police also participated that night. They also stopped the students. They also pointed guns at the students. They also helped coordinate the attacks, right? The army was also present in the streets that night, most likely from the evidence we have, coordinating and participating in the attacks, right? So the narrative from the state has consistently been based on zero evidence, this idea that a drug gang takes over and does all these things. Of course, the state's version is that the students were taken out to this open-air trash dump, murdered and incinerated, right? But 3.5 years later, there is not a single piece of forensic evidence testifying either to the murder and incineration of the students or even to a fire taking place at that trash dump on that night. Not only that, it turns out the world's leading fire experts conducted a study of that trash dump and said a fire that would be able to reach the temperature necessary to incinerate a single human body, not to mention 43, would have burned down all of the surrounding forest, right? And not only that, but the people who under torture testified to having built that fire and burned the students said that they walked up to it throughout the night and threw logs and fire and more diesel into the fire. Right? The fire expert said anyone who approached within about 20 meters would have themselves been burned to death. Right? So the state creates, through torture, a false story to disorient, and it's been incredibly successful. Yeah. They're very smart at what they do. Right? 3.5 years later, we're still talking about a place where nothing happened. Instead of looking for the students. Through the students, of course, many organizations and the parents themselves are constantly looking for the students. But through the institution of the state, it's the violent forcing of conversation to a location they control, because nothing happened there, and they know that, and they lie, and they keep lying, and they keep lying. And the Reforma article, for me, it's one of many stages of a heartbreaking series of events where not only does the state continue to torture these families by lying, but people that one might have hoped were serious and smart and critical fall into that game. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much for being here. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you all for coming and listening.